welcome to my channel, Anglican Aesthetics. You might notice my backdrop here is not my usual backdrop. I'm recording from my office here at my workplace. And so this is kind of a little bit of a temporary setup. It's not, unfortunately, my full setup. I don't know. Maybe you don't like this better. Maybe you do. I don't know. In any case, a few quick updates and then we're going to jump right in. Right now I'm building out my Patreon. I might build out a locals as well. I built a Substack. And on my Patreon, I'm actually going to make all of my journal articles available. Now, typically for journal articles, you have to pay exorbitant amounts of money. I'm going to include it as part of just my paid subscriber base, to make it more accessible to people. Academic publishing, if you might know, is kind of a little bit of a scam insofar as authors get nothing and the publishers take everything, and sometimes the authors are even charged to make their articles open access. So if you enjoy what I do, if you enjoy my scholarship, I'll attach it there. Otherwise, feel free to email me, and of course I'll send you it for free. Whatever journal article you're interested in. Okay, with that said, we're going to dive right in, and I'm also making video versions of all of my articles, so that theological knowledge, theological scholarship is just more widely accessible to the Church Catholic. Okay, so without further ado, let's dive right in. We're going to cover my article on providence, predestination, and free will. I just did a really great interview with Dr. Taylor Patrick O'Neill. I highly commend that interview. But I want to make my own views available, especially in light of criticisms that Joe Schmidt, who's a PhD student at Princeton, has put out. I hope my article can help sort of think about how we might conceive of God's relationship to the will and to freedom. Now we're going to start with a couple of definition of terms. Now, Molinism, if some of you might know, is a theory of God's providence and foreknowledge. Molinism posits three sorts of knowledge types in God: natural knowledge, by which God knows all that could happen; his free knowledge, by which God knows all that will happen; and his middle knowledge, that by which God knows all that would happen upon certain conditionals. So, for instance, God knows that if the miracles which had been done in Judea had been done in Sodom and Gomorrah, they would have repented. God knows that if I were to see cookie dough ice cream pop up right in front of me, I would eat it. Okay. So middle knowledge posits that there are these counterfactuals of creaturely freedom, of what creatures would freely do, and on that basis, on the basis of God's knowledge of those counterfactuals, God providentially orders and arranges the world. So, God can ordain all that comes to pass while yet preserving the freedom of creatures, by virtue of knowing what creatures would freely do in any given circumstance, and thereby sort of enacting, creating, arranging those circumstances. Now you might think, well, that still eliminates creaturely freedom. I actually don't think it does. For instance, consider a teacher. I've used this example many times. A teacher who knows that her student, little Timmy, is going to cheat on a pop quiz. So the teacher knows that if she gives this pop quiz, the student would freely choose to cheat. She gives the pop quiz knowing that the student would cheat if given the pop quiz. Now, it would be absurd for the student to thereby say, okay, you gave me this pop quiz knowing I would cheat on it? Well, you made me cheat then. I really had no choice in the matter. That would be an absurd response. So just because the teacher knows ahead of time what the student would freely do in the given circumstance, that doesn't mean actually that the teacher has caused the student to do what the student does. Now, sometimes there are some opponents of Molinism that will say, well, the analogy breaks down because God creates our creaturely being. He gives us being. He creates the entirety of our being. But that sort of objection begs the question. It's circular insofar as it assumes that our creaturely being is sufficient to explain our choices, which is exactly what the Molinist is denying. In other words, suppose there were some sort of being that knew the total history of the world right up to the moment of you making a given choice. The claim of the Molinist, and the Thomist, according to Dr. O'Neill, actually, interestingly, is that that being, from the knowledge of the total history of the world up to you making a decision, could not deduce your decision. In other words, the will itself is a unique causal contributing factor into the history of the world. You can't predict what it's going to do just from knowing the total history preceding the moment of your choice. Okay, so given that framework, Molinism has some problems with it. The most frequent problem, and the problem I find the most compelling, is what's called the grounding objection. And it typically goes like this. The unique contribution of Molinism is not that God has middle knowledge. Most groups agree, Calvinists, Thomists, agree that God foreknows what would come to pass upon given conditionals. That's not what's in dispute. What's in dispute is that these conditionals of creaturely freedom are what we might call pre-volitional. That is to say, that they are logically prior to God's decision to create a world. So there are certain things, right, that are logically prior to God's choice to make a world. For instance, the existence of God, right, is logically prior to his decision to create. The fact that God is good is logically prior to God's will, insofar as God's will is not the efficient cause of his being good. That is to say, that it's not that God chooses to be good and that's the reason why he's good. Rather, he is goodness itself. And so his will reflects his nature. And so all of the goodness that colors, as it were, his will and the exercises of his will are logically preceded by the fact that God is essentially good. Okay, so given this, how do we think about the interaction between God's will to create and creaturely freedom? Now, the problem that Molinists point to is that if you say that the will of God precedes, logically, the choice of the creature, then that choice is wholly determined by external circumstances, and that eliminates freedom. So, for instance, suppose that, unbeknownst to me, someone slipped a love potion in my drink. I actually think about the scene in Harry Potter, right, where Ron is given this love potion, and he falls madly in love with someone, right? Is Ron morally responsible? Is he responsible for that love? And ostensibly, he's not. Right? That's why he's so shocked when he sort of snaps out of it. He thinks he's willing to love who he loves, but really, there are these external forces which exercise and cause the movements of his will towards their particular exercise in loving someone. Okay, so from that, we might change the analogy, right? A scientist, unbeknownst to you, hooks up electrodes to your brain. The electrodes seemingly cause you to do stuff. They cause you to move in a particular direction. They cause you maybe to kill someone. And you think you're the one who's willing it. But in truth, the electrodes in your brain stimulated the relevant portions of your brain and moved you towards killing someone. Ostensibly, you wouldn't be responsible for that, because your choice was determined and efficiently guaranteed by a nexus, a sum total of forces that were logically external, that were other than your will. Those forces other than your will guaranteed the motion of your will, necessitated it, were the causal factors that were sufficient. In other words, that being who knew the whole history and the total composition of the world right up to the moment of your choice would have been able to determine and to deduce where the movement of your will would go. And that eliminates moral responsibility. I think the Molinist is actually right about that point. Now, the Molinist then posits that these counterfactuals of creaturely freedom were not caused by the will of God. So there are these, in other words, true counterfactuals about what you would do. And these counterfactuals are just description, right? And in a way, they're not really caused by anything, just like truth propositions are not, properly speaking, caused. They're just descriptions of what is true. It's my own view of propositions anyway. That propositions are just descriptions of what is the case. So before God's choice to create, then, according to the Molinists, there are all these counterfactuals of creaturely freedom which could have been entirely different, which, as it were, sort of constrain what God is able to create. Now, I think the Thomist and the Reformed theologian rightfully objects to this, because what this entails is that there is some aspect of reality that is creaturely, that is other than God, that isn't explained by the being of God. So divine aseity traditionally has wanted to say that all reality other than God is explained by the being of God. So creaturely being all around you is a kind of emanation, a kind of it is logically dependent on God's being. God's being is the sufficient explanation. And if we think about that, that means then that all that is not God is explained by God, at least by his being. All other reality other than God has the shape it does because, in one way or another, of God's being or his will. So if these counterfactuals of creaturely freedom are describing true things, then there's sort of some sector of truth. There's a set of true things which does not ultimately have its explanation in the being of God, and therefore God's being ceases, it seems, to be the ultimate explanation for all reality other than God. That's sort of the basic outline of the grounding objection. There are various responses to this. I don't think they're successful, but what I'm going to do is provide a kind of alternative. And this is where I think my article, some other people seem to have thought so too, makes a unique contribution to the discussion. Now, most of my viewers will know I'm sort of in the Augustinian Thomistic vein of providence, which means I mostly land with Aquinas on some of these questions. However, I think some of the insights of Molinism can actually be incorporated into that framework. So we're going to try to do that. This will be sort of the basic idea of the paper. Link that in the description. Now, we start with the doctrine of the divine ideas. The doctrine of the divine ideas says that all creaturely reality that proceeds from God, all other reality, is, as it were, modeled on the nature of God. So remember, God prior to creation is the sum total of all that exists. He is being in itself. So when God creates, he's not looking to an external world. He's not looking to something other than himself. It's not like he's gazing out into this sort of logical ether and like picking out ideas from there and then speaking them into being. Rather, God gazes at his own being. And so according to Aquinas, think Aquinas is right about this, God loves all creatures by loving himself, because creaturely being is just a kind of imitation all the way down of the divine nature. God can know a creature by knowing his own being in that creature's entirety, because that creature is an imitation, a communication, to use Jonathan Edwards' terminology, even an emanation, a beaming forth of the divine being into a creaturely modality. So prior to God's creation of the world, then, God knows all that could be, his natural knowledge, by knowing his own being. And within the set of all that could be, we find this category of middle knowledge, all that would happen on certain conditions. And because God's knowledge of all that could be is pre-volitional, that is to say that because God is the kind of God he is, prior to his will to create, all creaturely archetypes exist in the being of God prior to his will to create. So God knows creaturely reality and all creatures that could possibly be prior to his will to create by gazing at his being, which is what it is prior to his will to create. So, in other words, if God wills to create a unicorn, God, it would seem, had an idea of that unicorn prior to his will to instantiate the unicorn, right? Because he knows what he's creating ahead of creating it. Now, where does that idea come from? Well, the Thomist would say that it comes from God's gaze at his own being, in which God beholds a way that his divine nature can be imitated unicornly. So a unicorn is a kind of creaturely transposition the divine excellence, a transposition of the divine excellencies into a created modality, which takes the shape of a unicorn. So the unicorn, in its creaturely being, communicates something of the excellencies of God. And it is a creaturely communication of the excellencies of God. Kind of liken this idea to Lewis's notion of transposition. So if you think about transposition, right, we are able, it would seem, to communicate emotions in music. Now, there are some philosophers of music that think, well, we only hear a minor chord as sad because we've been conditioned to do it and this sort of thing. That doesn't seem to be the case. Now, that would require a whole video in itself to argue for. But it at least seems, and there are a good amount of philosophers of music that would agree with this, that music inscribes emotion. That is to say, emotions are transposed into a musical modality. So transposition is the taking of something in one domain and communicating it entirely in a different domain, like emotion to music. Okay? So the argument here is that God transposes the excellencies of his divine nature into a creaturely modality. And he knows ahead of time how to transpose his divine excellencies into particular creatures by looking at the divine being. Okay, so when we think about then the idea of a creature prior to God's will to create, there are certain things that are going to be true of that creature. So for instance, God knows that the idea of a horse ahead of his will to create the horse is equine, right? Is a mammal. So those things are true of the horse prior, or that to the idea of the horse prior to God's will to create it, be predicated of the horse as it pre-exists in the mind of God. What I argue is that the counterfactuals of creaturely freedom are pre-volitional, but they describe things that are true of the divine idea. Now, let's dive a little bit more into this notion of divine ideas. The counterfactuals of creaturely freedom, then, because the divine ideas couldn't be other than what they are, Against the Molinist, I want to say the counterfactuals of creaturely freedom actually couldn't be other than what they are. Now, this is true because of the following reason, right? Whenever God creates a world, he is creating a world in order to communicate the divine goodness. That is, in order to communicate the divine nature. God's end in creation is the communication of himself. Now, I've argued that in an article. I'll make that a video article as well. In short, the argument goes like this. If God creates the world for any given end, right? He creates the world for a reason. Presumably, he's creating the world for a good reason. That is, he creates the world for a reason, which he adjudicates to be a good reason. But if God's being is the source of all goodness, that is, if what it means for something to be good is that it reflects God in a particular way, then God chooses to create the world for a reason which is a God-reflecting reason. That is to say, if God chooses and adjudicates to create the world for a reason, and he selects that reason because it's a good reason, then God selects that reason because it's a God-reflecting reason, which means that God creates the world for a God-reflecting reason, because it reflects the divine goodness in a particular way. And creaturely reality, according to the doctrine of divine ideas, is all the way down a reflection of the nature of God. Okay, so if creaturely being is this sort of emanation, communication of the divine nature, and God creates the world as a communication of the divine nature, I think this suggests something about the way God conceives of free agents. When God, prior to the creation of the world, it's not as though God has to deduce the total history of the world. It's not like he's thinking sort of syllogistically, right? So if X happens, then what? Rather, he views the world and the history of the world as kind of what we would say organic whole. A symphony is a good example of this, right? Where it impacts you as an organic whole, or a major chord, right? Where you play three notes and you consider the entity as a whole. God considers the total history of the world as the sort of organic whole. And whenever he conceives of the idea of a creature, because he's always instantiating creatures in order to reflect the divine nature, he's considering a creature in terms of the nexus in which it is embedded. So that is to say that human beings, for instance, have bodies, right? But our bodies are historically conditioned things. I inherit the specific way I am, the specific way my body is, because of my relation to my parents, because of their particular DNA that they contribute to me. So, William Lane Craig often talks about, well, what if I had been born in a different era with different parents and yada, yada, yada. I actually don't think that's even metaphysically possible, because I think that would be a different being than me, because bodies are essential parts of human nature. Your particular materiality is an essential part of who you are. And so your parents, at least minimally, your social relations are the social relations that at least precede you, that precede your body, are essential to who you are. So God conceives of you within a sort of world history, I'd argue, a sort of nexus of world histories. Now, there are possibly different world histories in which you can exist within, but that is to say that whenever God conceives of the idea of Sean, he conceives of the idea of Sean within a total world history in which all of the factors that went into giving me the body I had are there. So that would mean that God views the idea of any creature, I think, within a total world history. And that total world history as an organic whole is a communication of the being of God, is a reflection of the divine nature. So prior to God's creation of any world, that would mean that by the contemplation of his own nature, and given that his will is always oriented towards the reflection, the communication of the divine nature, Aquinas puts it like this, that God always acts for his own goodness. And by Aquinas, but by which Aquinas means that God always acts sort of to communicate, to reflect the divine goodness. So that would mean that prior to the creation of the world, God has in his mind all of these ideas of the way in which creaturely being can reflect the divine nature, and he has that pre-volitionally. And there are a number of things that are true of those total world histories prior to the will of God to create the world. One of those things, according to my argument, one of those things which are true prior to that, to God's choice to create the world, are the counterfactuals of creaturely freedom. And so the reason they couldn't be other than what they are is for the same reason that the idea of a unicorn couldn't be other than what it is, or for the same reason that God couldn't be other than wise, right? It's not as though God's being wise is logically posterior to God's choice to be wise. And for the same reason, then, it's not as though God's idea of Sean, and all that is true of that idea of Sean, is logically posterior to the will of God to create Sean. Rather, it's logically prior. And some of those truths, I argue, are the counterfactuals of creaturely freedom, which means on this account you have both a genuine grounding, a genuine explanation for why the counterfactuals of creaturely freedom are what they are, and you have a non-causal, I'd say, explanation as well. So the counterfactuals of creaturely freedom are what they are because God's being is what he is, right? So why is it that humanity has the particular features that it does per the divine ideas, with respect to the divine ideas? Because God's being is communicated humanly in a particular way. So it's because God's being is what it is that human nature, prior to its existence, can be instantiated in the ways that it can be instantiated as, if that makes sense. Hopefully. And yet, this isn't an efficient cause, right? So why is God wise? Because he is wisdom itself. Why does he act wisely? And all of the acts he instantiates in creation reflect wisdom? Well, because of his being. In a similar way, why are the divine ideas? Why do they have the content that they do? Well, because those just are the ways that God's nature can be sort of reduced to and communicated in, transposed in a creaturely modality. Okay. All right. So I hope we're still tracking. So then the counterfactuals of creaturely freedom are genuinely pre-volitional, and they have an explanation which is not causal, for the same reason that God's being wise has an explanation that's not causal. So that means, per my account, that God does know what a creature would freely do in any given circumstance, and he hasn't determined it. That is to say, his will hasn't made that to be what it is. So then let's account for goodness and evil. What I want to suggest is that God does efficiently, but not necessarily sufficiently, and by which I mean, we'll have to distinguish this from theological terminology in terms of logical sufficiency. That is, God's grace does produce the good in people. All good that they do is sourced in God. But it's not the case that he does so in such a way that eliminates their agency or praiseworthiness. Because God's goodness, consider that sort of being, right? If this spiritual being knew the total history of the world, including God's causal activity in stirring the heart through beauty, that would not in itself be enough for that being to deduce what the creature would do. And yet God can elicit genuinely good free choices. The analogy I use is the analogy of beauty, right? If you see the beauty of a sunset, you almost, one might say that they can't help but say wow to that, right? So the beauty elicits praise. And yet, no one would say, well, the beauty of the sunset violated my will and forced me to praise it. There's a continuity between the beauty of the sunset and the movement of the heart. There is a sense, however, in which the beauty of the sunset is productive. It produces this movement of the will in my heart. Okay. So, God's grace, I think, is similar in that way. It's similar insofar as there's a genuine productive continuity between God's work in the heart and the good that people do, such that you can say God moved people to do the good. But it would take the shape of God's moving people or giving grace to people. And this is actually kind of congruistic, right? Congruism is this idea that God gives graces and elects, not based off of how he knows people would freely respond, but rather he elects people ahead of time solely in accordance with his pleasure for salvation, not according to anything he foresees in the creature, and consequently then chooses to give graces which he knows would elicit the free response of his creatures. That's the model of predestination I would go with, actually. Namely, this idea that God gives graces which he knows would freely elicit a free consent, a free embrace of divine grace. How does God reprobate then? Well, he chooses essentially not to give those graces. And so God actually does ordain all that comes to pass. Now, how does God harden hearts? I'd say that there are two ways in which God does this. God hardens hearts both by giving people over, that is, refraining from giving grace, and letting people spiral, letting people do what they're going to choose to do. And Calvin, I think, rightfully points out, the Westminster Confession points out that God at times does not only he doesn't only just permit, but Scripture seems to portray a sort of active hardening. How can God do it? Well, Calvin, and this is sort of fleshed out by Richard Sibbes, but Calvin talks about sunlight shining on a dead body, and yet it's not the light that stinks, but it's the body, right? So you can sort of think about God's grace as occasioning evil. So for instance, suppose there was someone that was really hostile to me, and I knew that if I said, well, have a good day, I knew that they would curse me out. They would say something like, go F yourself or whatever, right? It's not the case that my action, have a good day, right, caused that person to do that. It was the occasion in which that person freely chose to do that. And so in a similar way, God can send Moses to say, look, Pharaoh, repent, which is a grace, right? The call to repentance is actually a grace for humanity. It's a good thing. And so God can give that good to Pharaoh through Moses, and then Pharaoh, upon receiving that good, would then freely choose to harden his heart. So God moves Moses, works in Moses' heart, so as to elicit this free choice to say, Pharaoh, let my people go. Which then in turn, God can actually work on Pharaoh's heart so as to stir him, so as to put the stirrings of justice onto his consciousness. But Pharaoh then chooses to freely rebel against that. What I want to note is that there actually is still, even in this case, an asymmetry between the way God brings about good and between the way God even actively hardens hearts. Insofar as the goodness that God brings about is continuous with the activity in the heart. When we say beauty elicits praise, right, it's because there's a continuity between beauty a sort of productive continuity between the beauty of a sunset and the praise it elicits. In a similar way, there's a kind of productive continuity between God's activity in the human heart, the light of his grace, and the good action it elicits. Whereas God can shine that same light into Pharaoh's heart, and Pharaoh freely then chooses to harden his heart against that, even if God knew ahead of time that Pharaoh would do that. That's still different than God's knowing ahead of time that the person would freely choose to do good, because the good that someone does in response to God's grace has this kind of productive continuity in the same way that praise has this productive continuity with the beauty of a sunset. And the way to think about this is in the sense that if I pour water on a fire, the steam has a kind of productive continuity with the water. Whereas if I pour water on a person, and then the person, well, that's not, because that's not a great. If I pour water if I give water to a thirsty person, and the person takes the cup of water and says, "Well, F you, I don't need your handouts," right? There's a discontinuity between that kind of action and the response they give, whereas there's a continuity between steam and water. There's a continuity between the goodness of God's efficient causality, the light of his grace shining into a heart, and the response of praise, even if that light was not sort of causally sufficient to bring about the response of praise. There's a substantive continuity between the goodness of God's grace and the goodness of the response of praise, whereas there isn't that substantive continuity between the light of God's grace and someone's choice to then harden their heart in response to that grace, even if God knows the counterfactual ahead of time. The lack of continuity between the light of God's grace and the response makes the situations asymmetrical, makes them different. And we have an intuition of this, right? So if a mentor is kind to a child or something like that, and the child then pays that kindness forward, right? We have this image of a child receiving and then paying forth what the child received. That's different than if some child is like receives kindness from a mentor and then says to another kid, right, knowing that the kindness that they received, like, just wants to cruelly juxtapose the kindness they received and what they could give to another kid, right? Curses out that kid. There isn't that same sort of continuity between the action and the light received, which is morally significant, I think. So God can be the productive cause of all good, and then most of the time just give people over to their evil, right? Which is a less problematic form of God's ordination of evil. But then even in particular cases, in an active way, have an active role in divine judgment, in sort of steering people towards particular evils at particular times, while not being productive of those evils, by his grace being the occasion in which someone freely chooses to harden their own heart. So there are two ways, actually, God can harden people. He can give them over in divine judgment, and give graces which he knows actually people would freely harden their own heart in response to. Okay, so now here's where that leaves us then to summarize. God does ordain all that comes to pass. And he even ordains all that comes to pass on the basis of what he foreknows creatures would freely do in particular circumstances. The counterfactuals of creaturely freedom could not be other than what they are, because God conceives of a creature by looking at his own being, and thus all that is true of that creature is true in light of the way that creature, in the context of the total world story in which it could exist, reflects the being of God. God is the productive cause of all good in the will, while yet leaving intact its freedom in doing good. Insofar as God's productive producing of good, his working of grace and divine light on the heart is continuous with the person's response of praise, right? In an analogous way to how the beauty of a sunset is continuous with praise and therefore elicits praise. God can harden hearts in two ways: by giving people over, so just not giving grace, which would elicit praise, and even giving graces which occasion evil. And they don't elicit evil in that way, but rather they're the occasion in which God foreknows a creature would freely respond in a particular way. Now, what I'll do in part 2 of this video, because it dovetails actually into another paper where I wrestle with these lingering questions, right, is that even if I say that, okay, well, that preserves the responsibility of the reprobate in their own damnation, right, because they're not necessitated in any way to rebel against God. It leaves the problem of evil, namely why does God permit certain evils? Like, he ordains evil by, in virtue of seeing the world story, choosing not to give certain graces which would restrain those evil, and thereby permitting those evils for higher order goods. Why does God do that? Because on my model, the free will defense is out, right? It's not as though God saw how creatures were going to freely act ahead of time and then just kind of had to play with the cards he was dealt. Rather, God is oriented towards reflecting the divine goodness. And so if he permits evil, it has to be in the service of reflecting the divine goodness in a greater way. So why, right? Why is the permission of evil necessary to reflect the divine goodness? There's the problem still of the reprobate, right? So this model entails that God chooses not to give certain graces to the reprobate, which would elicit a free response. So there's that problem. Of course, then there's the problem of suffering in general, right? Why does God permit any suffering whatsoever, given that there's no external constraint, right? What is it about the being of God such that the permission of suffering would be necessary? I'm going to deal with those questions in part 2 when I cover my other paper, my model of providence, beatific governance, which is a more particular model and sort of addresses these questions in more fine-grained detail. I hope this is helpful. Thank you so much for watching. May the Lord bless you and keep you, and let me know what you think. God bless. Bye-bye.